defenders of Novodiretsk showed an epic repulse of a Russian attack. There, 2 Ukrainian soldiers stood against 8 Russian occupiers. When fire was opened on the enemy and half of their soldiers were eliminated, the Russians tried to hide in ruined houses, but the remaining members of their assault group were taken out by drone operators. Ukrainian soldiers also posted online the route of another Russian attack in the Konstantinivka direction. They reported that the enemy sent a tank and 2 IFVs to storm the area near Yablonivka. The Russian vehicles were neutralized by FPV drones and other firepower from several adjacent units. The soldiers note that the Russians pay a high price for such an attack, both in equipment and weaponry, as well as in personnel losses.
From a tactical standpoint, this is.
From a military perspective, it looks correct. On the map, it looks impressive. But after almost 3.5 years of war, we already know that such wide maneuvers, such broad flanking moves, those are definitely not for the Russian army. That's not their thing. And this task is impossible for them. They simply can't control such deep penetrations. That's why I'm sure they won't gain anything from this.
The soldiers also note that there has been an increase in attempts by the invaders to bypass Ukrainian defenses with small sabotage groups, especially in the Lyman and Pokrovsk directions. However, the movements of such groups are almost immediately detected by aerial reconnaissance, and strike drones with munitions destroy the enemy's manpower. Ukrainian soldiers repelled the most Russian assaults in the Pokrovsk direction. There, the Russians made 38 unsuccessful attempts to advance toward the defense forces' positions in the areas of 17 settlements. The Russian occupiers also tried to attack 18 more times in the Novopavlivka sector of the front. In addition, 8 assaults were repelled in the Torets direction, 7 each in the southern Slobozansk, as well as the northern Slobozansk and Kupiansk directions, and 5 in the Lyman sector of the front. And on the left bank of the Kherson region, Russian occupiers continue their attempts to seize strategically important positions near the Antonivsky Bridge. But Ukrainian defenders nip these attempts in the bud.
The enemy is trying to improve its tactical position specifically in this area, near the Antonivsky bridges, the railway, and the road bridges. We can see with what, kind of, suicidal, I would call it, persistence the Russians are trying to improve their positions. However, it's not working out for them. Well, accordingly, if these attempts are motivated by the desire to, place certain firepower there, it's also important to understand that our right bank is well defended, and in any case, these weapons will be destroyed.
Military experts note the successes of Ukraine's defense forces in the Dobropillia and Pokrovsk directions, where several settlements have been liberated.
Pankivka is actually right on the protrusion of the Russian incursion into Ukrainian defenses. In other words, what's happening is that with counterattacks, Ukraine's defense forces aim to cut off these heights. In the Pokrovsk direction, Ukraine's defense forces have successfully deoccupied Novo-Economic. These are significant tactical successes for our defenders. It's precisely these successes that allow us to say that Ukraine's defense forces have actually broken not just the military, but also the political component of the summer campaign.
Another 1,010 Russian servicemen were eliminated by Ukraine's defense forces over the past day. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, this brings the total losses of the Russian army to over 1,103,500 soldiers. In addition, over the past day, 5 tanks, 53 artillery systems, 2 multiple rocket launchers, 2 airplanes, 1 helicopter, and 123 units of enemy automotive equipment were destroyed.
Vladislav Seleznev, military expert. With him, we'll discuss what's happening now on different sections of the front. Vladislav, we're glad to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. Glory to Ukraine.
Good morning.
Energy, the feeling is mutual. Good morning. Glory to the heroes.
Vladislav, so what's your assessment of what we're seeing right now? Let's say, a general analysis of what's happening, particularly in the Novopavlivka direction, and also in the Pokrovsk direction, right? And taking into account that the President, both during his visit to New York and in his talks and meetings with the President of the United States, Donald Trump, spoke about certain advances, yes, that the Ukrainian armed forces are making.
Yes, absolutely. The situation on the battlefield remains quite dynamic and complex. There are two sections of the front that stand out in particular for the intensity of combat operations you mentioned, Novopavlivka and, accordingly, the direction toward Pokrovsk and Myrnarad. It is precisely there that the majority of clashes take place over the course of a day. The report from the Ukrainian General Staff for the past day is a vivid confirmation of this. The enemy is trying to use its numerical and logistical superiority to achieve a number of its ambitions. These ambitions are quite serious. The enemy, well, is literally dreaming of taking full control of both Myrnarad and Pokrovsk and advancing through parts of Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia regions toward Huliapol. In other words, the enemy's plan is quite ambitious. To carry out these plans, they are deploying resources, including additional ones, those very several thousand Russian servicemen who were recently in the Sumy region and also operating in the north of the Kharkiv region. They have now been relocated to the southern regions of our country and are already involved in active combat operations there. By the way, I think it's no coincidence that the Russians so quickly and urgently withdrew their forces and assets after the exercises on the territory of the Republic of Belarus. I'm referring to the large-scale maneuvers of the Russian and Belarusian armies, Zepad 2025. I believe that most of these Russian resources have already been sent to combat units participating in the so-called special military operation. But, frankly speaking, battles on the battlefield are nothing new for us. After all, de facto, since mid-October 2023, the Russian army has been trying to advance relentlessly. As for the results, as we can see, even the American leader admitted that the effectiveness of these large-scale, in fact operational tactical and even strategic-level enemy offensives, is worthless. In more than 1,000 days of active offensive operations, the enemy has managed to capture less than 1% of our country's territory, and, basically, the part of Donetsk region that is such a coveted target for the enemy at the current pace of, well, with the enemy's advance, the fighting could go on in this area for more than a year. I've seen different estimates, 1 year, a year and a half, even 2 years. Therefore, it's obvious that the attrition rate for Russian forces and assets will continue to rise. There will be enough resources to pursue this ambitious goal of occupying the entire territory of Donetsk region. It's what you might call a close call. After all, it's clear that the enemy, especially as Ukrainian defense forces employ the tactic of 1,000 small cuts, is gradually losing its offensive potential. And that means the enemy's current ambitions are by no means guaranteed to ever become reality.
Vladislav, overall, that's not quite the case, especially when we talk about what's happening now on the front lines, including at the line of contact. Indeed, we see that Ukraine's defense forces are doing tremendous work to hold back this onslaught coming at us from the aggressor country. They clearly have, even just mathematically, a greater number of troops and certain types of weapons. Overall, if we talk about some kind of parity, yes, we discussed this a lot at the beginning of the full-scale aggression. If we look at what's happening right now, currently, a lot of attention and a very significant role is being given to drones on the front line as well. A lot has changed now. But have we managed to achieve any kind of parity? Yes, on the front lines for the Ukrainian defense forces.
If we're talking about drone systems, then without a doubt, we are definitely at the forefront here, the leaders, because using a fairly large number of modern enemy striking systems is producing pretty good results. And although the enemy has some pretty serious electronic warfare systems that are designed to, well, effectively counter our drones, as we can see, the strikes, including those under the Deep Strike project, are delivering very, very positive results. The past 24 hours were marked by a rather large-scale drone attack on various regions of the Russian Federation. Right now, this information is still being compiled. I mean the results of these very same deep strikes, the Ukrainian Bavovna, in various regions of the Russian Federation. But even at this early stage, it's clear that there were such strikes, and they were quite effective. As usual, the targets of these attacks were Russian army military facilities, military infrastructure, as well as sites belonging to the fuel and energy complex of the Russian Federation. And basically, no matter what Russian propagandists say, like, the situation is stable and supposedly under the full control of the Russian government, that's just not true. Disruptions in at least 20 regions of the Russian Federation, timely and full deliveries of petroleum products, popular grades of gasoline, and diesel fuel are already having the effect where the local people are starting to get nervous. Honestly, what are we even surprised about? This is the result of the Russian society's attitude, like, we're outside of politics, we're not interested in politics. Well, now, as they say, it's right in front of us. Already now, the local population is already experiencing difficulties getting access to fuel. But honestly, that's not even the most important thing. What's important is that the Russian army will very likely start facing difficulties in the near future getting the necessary amount of petroleum products to carry out various operations. After all, it's obvious that petroleum products are the lifeblood of the army. No diesel fuel, tanks stop moving, no aviation fuel, fewer Russian bombers and fighters take to the skies. Yes, of course, the process of draining the offensive potential of the Russian army is quite a long-term one. But in my opinion, the tactic of 1,000 small cuts is the most effective and continues to, bleed the Russian army dry.
Vladislav, next I'd like you to comment on one of the statements made by the Commander-in-Chief. Ukraine needs more air defense and electronic warfare systems, and there is also a need for long-range missiles. This was stated by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky, during a video conference with the Commander of the U.S. Army Europe and Africa, General Christopher Donahue. Syrsky also briefed him on the situation at the front.
And of course, in general, the statement from the General Staff's press service following the conversation between the Commander-in-Chief and his American counterpart essentially reflects the core requests of Ukraine's defense forces. There is no such weapon that we would call a Wunderwaffe, meaning a weapon capable of radically changing the situation on the battlefield. Only a comprehensive system that uses different types of weapons, ammunition for those weapons, equipment, technologies, and gear allows us to have a technological advantage on the battlefield. It's obvious that we need a sufficient number of electronic warfare systems. The enemy, preparing for a full-scale war with Ukraine, spent at least 20 years in preparation, using that time to produce a huge quantity and wide range of electronic warfare systems, from the tactical to the operational strategic level. That's why it's quite difficult for us to break through the Russian air and missile defense system, especially in those regions that are a priority for the enemy. As for our own capabilities, in this area, we are forced to play catch-up with the enemy. However, credit must be given to the Ukrainian defense industry and responsible Ukrainian businesses. Recently, we've managed to acquire quite a few effective models of this equipment, which allows us to efficiently neutralize enemy drones. It's no coincidence that the enemy is literally being forced to switch to fiber optic drones, just to achieve some results on the battlefield.
And Vladislav, overall, yes, yesterday almost the whole world was watching what was happening at the UN. There, let me remind you, it was an anniversary session and a lot of world leaders gathered. And, of course, there was a lot of discussion about what's happening, including in Ukraine. The Ukrainian defense forces are doing an excellent job repelling attacks by the Russian army. These are the words of US President Donald Trump. He said this during a meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky in New York. According to the head of the White House, such a prolonged war is causing irreparable damage to the Russian economy, which the Kremlin did not anticipate. But, in turn, the president of Ukraine noted that the pressure on Russia is still insufficient and called for tougher sanctions. Let's listen to their direct statements and then briefly discuss this further.
In the past month, our soldiers have deoccupied 360 kilometers of territory. Not without your help. We are grateful for the PRO program, which allows us to purchase weapons. We really hope that with your help, Russia will stop the war. There needs to be more pressure on Russia, primarily from the United States. Ukraine is doing a very good job stopping this very large army. It's simply astonishing. You know, this war was supposed to be over in 3 or 4 days. People said it would end very quickly, and credit must be given to the Ukrainian soldiers and everyone involved. It's still going on, and that's not good for Russia.
Those were the kinds of statements made, Vladislav. Have you been following the events in New York? Maybe you also noticed some statements or, well, some new points in the statements made at the anniversary session?
Yes, absolutely. I noticed a change in the rhetoric of the American leader when we heard him say, "Mr. President Zelensky, you don't have any maps." Now, however, the American leader is saying completely different, diametrically opposite things. But I remain a skeptic. I don't believe that even the most encouraging political statements are capable of fundamentally changing the situation on the battlefield. But the delivery of weapons and ammunition for those weapons, that's exactly the case that allows us to feel confident enough on the battlefield. and, in principle, there are significant changes. Yes, the current American administration is not in a hurry to provide us with weapons and ammunition for free, but this agreement with our European partners allows us to receive the same American weapons for money, including money from frozen Russian assets. So, in fact, the aggressor country, the Russian Federation, is now paying for our resilience, our defense, with its own funds.
Vladislav, thank you very much for joining our broadcast and for this analysis.
Thank you.
You're always welcome here. Vladislav Seleznev, military expert, was with us live.
Subscribe to UATV English and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.